ESMT, to all of you who are here in our auditorium 4, and also, of course, to our online audience in the online stream. So my name is Georg Garlichs. I'm I'm the CFO here and one of the managing directors at ESMT. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, Dollar Signs, the Myth of American Decline and the Future of World Order. And I'm very happy to see so many faces here, so many people coming to this event. Joining us for this is Professor Mark Copelovitch. Mark, very warm welcome. I hope my pronunciation of your name is more or less at least correct, I hope. The Axel Springer Fellow at the American Academy currently here in Berlin, and Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Copelovitch is also the Jean Monnet Chair in the European Union and the Global Economy and the visiting researcher in the Transformations of Democracy Research Group at the WZB. He studies international political economy, and his research explores the political causes and consequences of economic shocks and the politics of international organizations. Welcome, Mark, and we're very much looking forward to your remarks. Let me just add, joining you, you will be joined on stage with Jan Nimczik, who's Assistant Professor of Economics here at ESMT Berlin. His expertise lies in labor market analysis, particularly examining the internal organization and roles of firms, labor market outcomes, and inequality. So we're very much looking forward to remarks and then to discussion. And please join me in welcoming Mark.
Danke, guten Abend. Ich freue mich, hier zu sein. Und ich möchte der ESMT für die Einladung danken. Und ich möchte Georg für die freundliche Einführung danken. So, and all of you for coming as well, and everybody watching online. You may be expecting an optimistic talk. I know as I have talked to people in Berlin here about the title, they sort of say, why are you so unexpectedly optimistic about the United States? But I will get to the pessimism by the end of the talk, I promise you. As Georg mentioned, I study international political economy, so I'm trained as a political scientist, but I study the intersection of international relations and international politics and the global economy and international economics. And so I'm going to talk primarily about the dominance of the dollar in the global financial system, and I am an optimist about the continuing dominance of the dollar. And I will try and draw out, this is a book project that I'm working on in the early stages, we'll try and draw out what I think that means and how that hasn't been taken into account seriously enough for bigger picture discussions about American hegemony and great power rivalry in the international system and topics of those sorts. So before I get into discussing the dollar, I want to take you on a little history tour. So I am approaching 50 years old. And for as long as I have been aware of international relations and international politics, American hegemony has been on the cusp of decline or the end. So this is August 1971, 2 weeks after Richard Nixon took the US off of gold and brought down the Bretton Woods system in 1971. And Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, is proclaiming that the structural change is happening in the international system and the foundations of American power are disappearing. We stopped talking about that for a while, and then about 15 years later, we started talking about that again. This is Chalmers Johnson, an American political scientist at the time, but there were a lot of articles, and many of you probably remember when Japan was going to pass the United States and be the new global economic and possibly military hegemon. Again, similar discussions of how there is now a structural change in power in the international system, starting with trade, moving into possibly finance, and maybe later into international security issues. This is what I remember, and those of you that remember the late 1980s and early 1990s, I was in the beginnings of high school at the time, and these were the books that were popular on the New York Times bestseller list, and these were the movies and books that were popular in sort of popular culture, all of which were about head-to-head tripolar competition, the ascendancy of Japan, the rise and fall of great powers, right, and Paul Kennedy drawing out, right, what this meant for American hegemony, possible coming war with Japan, and the greatest Christmas movie of all time. This is Die Hard, and jokes about how the Japanese, right, militarily didn't conquer the United States, but they were going to do it with economics in the 1980s and the 1990s. And of course, we all remember what happened with Japan and the lost decade. We stopped talking about the end of American hegemony during what we started calling the unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War. And we pretty much stopped talking about that right up until Lehman Brothers and the global financial crisis again. But this was in 2008 on the front cover of the New York Times Magazine in the same discussions of the end of American hegemony. The US is now competing and losing in a tripolar world, and we have structural changes in geopolitics. And again, we stopped talking about that for a while after the global financial crisis and the sort of reascendancy of the United States economically. And then we started talking about it again in the last couple of years. So this is my colleague Dan Nexon at Georgetown University with Alex Cooley, just wrote a book called Exit from Hegemony, making effectively the same argument that we have been hearing since the 1970s now. And this is what sort of has motivated me in this project, thinking about why do we keep doing this, right? We have been predicting the end of American hegemony for about 50 years now, and it keeps not happening. So there's something about the model, right? I'm a social scientist, so I think about theories and models, and there's something about the model that is wrong, right? And what I will try and argue and convince you of, and at least start to convince you of tonight, is that the model is wrong because we don't think seriously enough about the global economy and international finance and the dominance of the dollar in international finance. Right? When we think about international security, and when I talk to my international relations colleagues in the political science department at Wisconsin who study guns and bombs and war and nuclear weapons, they think about power in these terms, but they never talk about international finance. Right? And in a related set of debates, which is more happening amongst economists and public policy scholars in the United States, we are having constant discussions about the unsustainability of US debt and deficits, right? With the same gloom and doom projections. That group of scholars and analysts also is not really thinking about global finance, right? We're often drawing on household analogies, thinking about the US is not able to sustain debt because it's past some arbitrary threshold of 100% of GDP or whatnot. And so the argument I want to make, and again, hopefully convince you, is that ultimately international power is about international finance. And that when you think about power in the international system through the lens of finance, the dominance of the dollar and the power of the United States structurally in the international system is actually as strong as ever, and arguably in some ways even more strong than it was in the 1970s or 1990s or a decade ago. And that there really is not a serious challenger to the dollar's role. There also, by the way, and I'll talk about this as I go on, there really is not a serious challenger to the euro's role as the #2 currency in the international financial system. And so when I talk about American power, I'm also talking about the structural dominance of transatlantic finance in the international system. What does that mean, right? So the first half of this talk is going to be talking about dollar dominance and showing you evidence of that. The second half is going to be teasing out the implications of that, the so what. That reports of the decline of American hegemony are somewhat greatly exaggerated. Reports of our inability to afford things as a country are exaggerated, and that we do have serious problems in the United States. Everybody here that I encounter in Berlin wants to talk about those very, very serious problems. I thought I was coming to Berlin for the year and getting away from the American election, and that has proven not at all to be the case. But those are problems about domestic politics. Right? Sort of rising authoritarianism, our deeply dysfunctional political institutions. The US has a lot of serious problems. Secular decline in the structural power of the United States in the international system is not one of them. Right? And in fact, the plausible challengers, China and the EU, actually have as many serious problems as the United States, if not more. All right, so if you want to tune out, that was sort of the quick summary of the talk. But if you want to keep with me and keep going, what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is to give you a sense of the multidimensional dominance of the dollar in the international system. So I show this chart to my undergrads. This is the defining feature, in my view, of international relations, right, over the last 50 years. So what are you looking at here? The Bank for International Settlements in Basel collects data on cross-border banking claims and other sort of global financial metrics. This is the 40-fold increase in international financial flows since the end of the Bretton Woods system. Right? With everything else that has happened in international relations over the last 5 decades, this is the thing that is historically unique and unprecedented more than anything else. To give you a sense of that, trade over the same time has tripled from about 25% of global GDP to 75% of GDP. World GDP output has increased by a factor of 10. Financial flows have increased by a factor of 40. So when we think about what is new in international relations, most of the things that we think of that are new, there's a historical analog from the 1930s or the 1890s or the 1700s, and you can go back and say mostly nothing is new under the sun, but this is a fundamentally unprecedented level of financial integration. And you see how that came down a little, right, during the global financial crisis, but it's come back and it's deeper than it's ever been. And at the heart of that is the dominance of the dollar as the primary international reserve currency. Right? So these are the currencies that governments and central banks hold as foreign exchange reserves. Right? And you see here the dollar is basically at 60%, the euro is at 20%, and then there's everybody else. Right? China is in there at about 4 or 5% now. And so that has been a structural feature going all the way back to the 1950s, right? 1940s, 1950s. If you look at this chart, this is what drives the narrative, which is probably the opposite of what I'm saying, that you've read in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or Handelsblatt, which is the dollar is declining, the renminbi is rising, we're going to have multiple key currencies now. And the evidence for that is that the dollar has gone from 71% of reserves to 59%. But now we're going to zoom out and we're going to go back historically. So this is back to the 1960s, looking at that same chart. Right? And you see the value at 1999 was something of an artificial maximum. Right? You see the dollar as a share of reserves was actually down in the late 1980s below 50%, and then it went up at around 1999 to about 71%. Anybody know why that happened? What happened in the 1990s? We had the EMS crisis. We had the launching of the euro. We had concerns about whether the euro was going to be a stable, low inflation currency to replace the Deutschmark as the number 2 currency in the international system. And there was a bit of a flight into the dollar. But if you go back and you go all the way back to the 1960s, you see there's sort of fluctuations in noise, but basically the dollar has been at roughly the same level now for many, many decades. The other thing to note is the dollar has come down by about 3 or 4% in the last 5 years or so in terms of its share of global reserves. That is entirely due to the fact that the Chinese finally 7 years ago started reporting data to the IMF on the renminbi. So it's not actually that the dollar has come down, it's that we have better data and we don't have missing data in the time series now. So that is one dimension. Right? This is a broader dimension. I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but you can think about the dollar's dominance is really across the spectrum, right? And actually, I'll come back to this one, but I'm going to show you this chart first. So Carlin Norloff at the University of Toronto has come up with this term of full spectrum dominance of the dollar. It's not just in foreign exchange reserves. It's the denomination of international debt. It's the denomination of international bank loans. SWIFT is the payments network where banks can talk to each other and make international transactions. And then foreign exchange turnover, the trillions of dollars of foreign exchange turnover in global markets. And again, it's not just the dollar, it's the dollar and the euro together. Right? So when we think about global financial flows and international monetary transactions, it's basically the US, the Eurozone, and then there's everybody else, right, in very, very small numbers, including China. And this is a way to think about that. It's the same graph, but the IMF is constructed and the Federal Reserve, what they sort of think of as a full spectrum index. Right? So if you throw in all of those variables and say, what does that time series look like? Again, it looks like the dominance of the dollar is at least as strong now as it was back in the 1970s and 1980s when we started thinking about the end of American hegemony. Right. All right, so before I talk about the euro and the renminbi as possible challengers, just a minute on what do we need to be the dominant international currency? Right? Why is the dollar dominant? Well, you have to be big in the global economy. You have to be open. Since the 1970s, when the Bretton Woods system collapsed over the next 20 years, countries opened up and removed capital controls, barriers to the flow of finance across borders. And so if you're going to be the dominant international currency in the 21st century, you have to be open to financial flows, and you can't have capital controls. You need deep, liquid, private financial markets. Right? When we think about what does it mean to be the dominant international currency, it's that people want to put their money in your country. They're not just buying currencies, they want to hold assets that are denominated in that currency. Right? So you have to have financial markets that provide enough assets. You need large sovereign bond markets, you need large corporate bond markets, right? You need large stock markets, and they have to be open, and there has to be a lot of liquidity and turnover so that it is easy for people to put their money in and then to take it back out. The other thing, probably most of all, is that somebody, when the world economy is on fire, and we've had a bunch of fires in the world economy over the last 15 years, someone has to step in to backstop the international financial system, what's known as the international lender of last resort. And I'll show you in a second, the Federal Reserve has basically been playing that role increasingly over the last 15 years now. Right? You also possibly, those used to be flags, but they're not anymore. So you also quite likely need to be a democracy. Right? If the renminbi were to become the dominant international currency, it would be the first time in the history of the modern world economy that the country issuing the dominant international currency was an authoritarian regime. All right? So if you go back in history all the way back to the Dutch in the 15 and the 1600s, every one of the countries, right, the Netherlands, France, Britain, and the United States, was the most or among the most democratic country of its time. Right? So there's a question about transparency and the credibility of property rights commitments and things like that that also goes with it. So when we think about that, it really starts to reinforce, right, how powerful is the United States and how dominant is the dollar in international finance. So these charts you're looking at, these are charts from a paper from the European Commission about who issues the AAA high-quality financial assets in the global economy. And the answer is the United States, almost exclusively. Right? So again, you see some of that is in the Eurozone, some of that is coming from Britain or Switzerland or Canada. But if a country is going to surpass the United States as the issuer of the dominant international currency, it is going to have to assume that role by having financial markets big enough, by issuing enough sovereign debt, that there are enough what we call safe assets for people to hold in the global financial system. Right? This is the lender of last resort chart. I know it's a little hard to read, but you don't need to see much of it to get a sense. These are swap lines from the Federal Reserve to the other major central banks in the global economy. So what is that? That's basically the Federal Reserve opening up lines of credit, dollar-denominated credit, to the Bank of England, to the Bank of Canada, to the Bank of Japan, to the ECB. So they have enough dollars on hand, right, to manage things and lend out into the banking system and the financial system when you have a financial crisis. Right? You see both during the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis, the Fed did that in unprecedented ways. The ECB has started to do that. The People's Bank of China has started to do that a little bit, but the amounts are tiny. Right? So the swap lines exist between central banks, but the amount that is actually being provided by the ECB or the People's Bank of China is minuscule compared to what is being provided by the Federal Reserve. Right? And so there's a question about who's going to do that globally. There's also, as you know, the question of who is going to do that in the Eurozone. Right? So what are you looking at here? You're looking at bond spreads, right? Many of you have seen this chart, I'm sure, which is the bond spreads on long-term bonds during the Eurozone crisis. So you have Greece and Italy, you have France and Germany, right? And you had this big spread because what is the safe asset in the Eurozone? It's German bunds. So people want to hold German bonds as the safe asset in the Eurozone. The problem is there are not enough German bonds to go around to really be the safe asset in the Eurozone, let alone to be the safe asset at the global level. Right. So again, I imagine many of you have seen this chart. This was the staff of the finance ministry when Wolfgang Schäuble left on the day he left in 2017, and they lined up in the courtyard in the shape of the Schwarze Null. Right. You can't be the global lender of last resort or the European lender of last resort if you were the country running massive current account surpluses, right, and running permanent budget surpluses. Those are simply fundamentally incompatible mechanical things when you think about the current account and the capital account. Right? The US runs big current account deficits because it runs massive capital account surpluses because people want to hold dollars and there's money flowing into the international system. So the Eurozone could do that. The Eurozone could run very large current account surpluses and very deficits. Right? The Chinese could do that, but as I'll come back to politically, right, neither actor is willing to do that. And this is getting locked in, as you know if you've been following the news, with the revisions to the Stability and Growth Pact. Going forward, the incentives for Eurozone countries, right, to engage in more fiscal austerity and budget tightening is going to place a further constraint again on the provision of safe assets, both in the Eurozone and at the global level. The other problem with the Eurozone, before I move on to talk about China, is that the Eurozone is the #2 international currency, but it is a currency without a country. Right? And I talk about this with my undergrads, and they've all seen Hamilton, the musical in the United States. But the Eurozone is going through the same discussions that the United States had from the 1790s up until the 1870s, when we became a full monetary union. The US wasn't a full monetary union and political union really until after the Civil War, right? So the debates about whether we had a Hamiltonian moment with the Recovery and Reinvestment Fund, right? We haven't had the political and fiscal integration, right? And so if the euro were to really want to be a challenger to the dollar as the dominant international currency, you almost certainly would need to see a move towards deeper fiscal and political union. And it's not clear that there's political support for that now or in the next several decades, possibly if ever. All right, so what would have to happen for the euro to rival the dollar? And I'm just going to put this up, and I'm not going to read them all off. You can see them, and I'm happy to take some questions about them. But the summary is there's a set of things that would have to happen for the euro to supplant the dollar, all of which are fundamentally incompatible with both EU level and German politics at the moment. You sort of look at these things on this list and think about what is the probability that any of these things is going to happen, and it's very, very small. At least in my view, it is very, very small. All right, so let me spend a couple minutes now also talking about China as a possible challenger. All right, and this is every 2 months over the last 3 years now, it feels like you read in one of the major global financial papers a prediction of the end of the dollar and the rise of the renminbi, and we're moving to a multi-currency world. The question with China is not, are there enough safe assets? It's whether there are any safe assets at all. What you're looking at here is a measure from my colleague Mincy Chin, who's an economist at Wisconsin, who has gathered data on the use of capital controls by countries. Okay. It's data from the IMF, and he creates an index. The short version is if you are completely open to international finance, you're a 1. That means no capital controls. And if you're completely closed off, you're a 0. Okay, so that's kind of how you can read it. You see, rich Western democratic countries have opened up since the 1990s, basically almost completely to international finance. China still has extensive capital controls, especially on outward flows of finance. Right, moving money out of the country. Okay, so are there any safe assets? If you're an international investor, it's easy to put money into China. It's hard to take money out. Right? And in fact, there is evidence right now that wealthy individuals in China are parking their money into gold, not into renminbi denominated assets, because they are worried about the future state of the economy. So the question with China again is, are there safe assets or not? More broadly, China is very, very large in international trade. They are very, very tiny in international finance. So this chart you're looking at here, it's from Helene Ray, the French economist. Over here is the international trade network. So you can think about how big are countries in international trade and who do they trade with. This is global financial flows of portfolio investment. You can find China, but they're up in there. They're very, very small. Right? So China is a military superpower. They are a trade and manufacturing superpower. They are very small in the international financial system. Their currency is not convertible and they haven't removed capital controls yet. And if you think about in the same way as I mentioned with the euro a couple minutes ago, if you think about what would China have to do for the renminbi really over the next 15, 20 years to rival or replace the dollar as the dominant international currency, it is a set of things which are completely incompatible with the domestic politics of Xi Jinping's personalist authoritarian regime, right? Again, if you start to think about assigning probabilities to each of these things, I would argue they're very, very low, especially the democratization one. Right? That's not to say that the renminbi can't go from being 4% of international financial flows to being 10% or 15%. But at that level, it's not even a challenger to the Eurozone's #2 position, let alone to the dollar's #1 position. Right? All right. So before I talk about the broader implications, if you know the Lord of the Rings, this is sort of how I think about this in summary, which is there will be a day long after I'm gone, probably in the early 22nd century, when maybe dollar hegemony is going to come to an end. Right? But it's not this day, and it's not likely to be anytime in the next several decades. All right, so again, as I mentioned, my work is sort of at the intersection of international economics and international politics. Now I'm going to put more of the political science hat on and start to think about the geopolitical implications of all of this. And again, this is the part that I think is missing, especially in the United States in the kind of national security and US-China rivalry discussion, which is dominated by people who focus on the defense side and AI and security issues. So if you think about what would it cost China to surpass the United States and challenge the United States in terms of military spending and a new Cold War, right? You may or may not believe there's a new Cold War going on. I'm not sure that I do, but if there was going to be a new Cold War, what would it take? And which country has the financial resources to sustain that? It's not obvious to me that you would be betting on China and the renminbi relative to the United States and the dollar. Lots of domestic political reasons why we might not be able to sustain that. But as a capacity issue for the US to sustain that, unquestionably we could. And that is something which is missing. This is one article from Foreign Affairs this past week, but it's representative of most articles that you read about this. That financial dimension is completely missing, right, in the United States from discussions about the rise of China, the US-China rivalry, right, where you have the discussion of, right, we have to choose between meeting the challenge of China and maintaining primacy because of cost, and we simply can't afford things. Right? That's the part that I think is just empirically wrong. Right? We might choose for domestic political reasons, or we might decide it's not the right thing to do. Right? But the ability of the United States to maintain its footprint as a global military superpower is very, very easy given our financial resources. So you hear the discussion that is going on in Washington right now, particularly within the Biden administration. Right? So you have Kathleen Hicks, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Rush Doshi, you may have read this book, The Long Game. He is now the head of the China desk on the National Security Council. You hear that, right, China is an increasing threat with hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, drones. They're building an aircraft carrier fleet finally to challenge us. And that there is a pacing challenge, or China's playing the long game to supplant the US in terms of military hegemony. But there is no discussion of the financial side of that, right? And so that's a part that I think is missing. And again, if China really is going to mount a serious military threat, it is going to take resources, and that brings the financial side into question. All right, just very briefly, the other thing I want to do is talk about the macroeconomic side of it, right? And I just want to start with this again as the defining feature, this 40-fold increase in the dominance, in the flows of international finance, because the other thing that everybody is obsessed about in Washington these days, aside from China, is the unsustainability of American debt and deficits, right? So you just have three people on here, but this is a bipartisan thing that has been going on, like the decline of American hegemony, for a very long time. This was the Democratic speaker Jim Wright in the 1980s talking about unsustainable debt. Bob Dole at the 1996 Republican presidential convention talking about our unsustainable debt. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, talking about the unsustainable debt. We have these discussions every 5 years, every 3 years, whenever the debt ceiling needs to be renewed, et cetera. And again, when you think about this amount of money looking for safe assets in the international financial system, it doesn't really seem to make sense that the US, the issuer of the international reserve currency, needs to worry about the debt to GDP ratio being 100% of GDP, when in a world of far less finance, it used to be 50% of GDP. Right? That's a variable that people focus on because it's a large number. The other thing to focus on is Japan's debt to GDP ratio is more than twice the United States. Right? So the issuer of the number 3 international reserve currency for decades now has sustained a level of debt far, far greater than that of the United States. Now, why do we think about this? One reason we think about this is that what I call the worst zombie idea in economic policy never goes away, which is the idea that the government is like a household. Right? And again, this is advanced by all parties in Washington. Just showing you President Obama and how he talked about things during the height of the global financial crisis in 2010, which is we should tighten our belt. Right? And the tone and the rhetoric and the implication that there's something moral about budget surpluses is something that I think resonates in Germany with the discussion of the Schuldenbremse and the Schwarze Null. It's kind of very similar. But that is something that I think politically has dominated our debate and economically doesn't really make sense. So this is what I say to my dad when he sort of comes up with the household analogy, because he does it periodically. Does your household do any of these things? Right. Sovereign debt finance for countries that issue international reserve currencies, completely different than what we think about debt for households. Right. So the idea that debt is bad, the idea that the government can't spend countercyclically when the economy is bad, or that it shouldn't do that, is something that really dominates American political debate. I think it dominates German political debate. But simply when you're talking about countries that issue international reserve currencies, those types of constraints don't apply. The other thing that I would just flag quickly, I know you can't read this chart, but this is the interest rate on US government debt going all the way back to the founding. So you can just kind of look at the line, right? And you can see over time with technology, the rise in size of American financial markets, the country getting richer, globalization of finance, interest rates over the long term take out the one event that everybody obsesses about, which is the oil shocks of the 1970s, you have a long-term secular decline in interest rates, right? You can go back even further. So a scholar at the Bank of England has done this going back to the 1300s. And these are interest rates over the last 700 years, right? So we live in a world of unprecedented global finance where over the long run, interest rates are declining over time, right? So this idea, again, that at 100% debt to GDP, the issuer of the world's dominant international currency is facing an imminent budget constraint where it can't afford things is something that in many ways really doesn't make sense. Right? All right, I'm going to skip over that. The one other thing that I do want to show you is this, right? This is also, by the way, why is it that Japan is able to sustain debt to GDP close to 300%? We owe most of the debt to ourselves. Right? Who owns American debt? It's the Federal Reserve and domestic borrowers. So we issue debt in the currency that we create in almost unlimited amounts. Right? So you often hear, well, China owns all of our debt and they're going to weaponize it and they're going to destroy the US economy. There's lots of reasons why they wouldn't want to do that even if they could. But the reality is 2/3 of American debt we owe to ourselves. Right? So again, yet another reason why thinking about we have a sort of imminent hard budget constraint doesn't really make sense. And I also think about why don't we ask about China's unsustainable debt? Right? So China's debt to GDP ratios are as high as ours. Their private credit debt bubble is much worse than ours. It looks like Japan in the 1990s. And China is a country that is 1/5 as wealthy as the United States. Right? So why isn't the dominant narrative that the middle income country with debt to GDP ratios close to 300% has unsustainable debt rather than the issuer of the dominant international currency, right? And the other thing that China is facing, right? These are projections, and depending on who you ask, you get different projections. But the projections are over the next 100 years that China's population is going to shrink somewhere between 25 and 50%, right? While the U.S. population is likely to continue to grow slowly, right? So an economy with the debt level of China and the United States that is at 1/5 of American GDP per capita, whose population is rapidly shrinking, is much more likely to face hard fiscal constraints than the United States. All right, so lots of optimism about the dominance of the United States and the persistence of the dollar. I'm going to end on the pessimistic note, which is that's not the real concern, right? And so one of the reasons I'm working on this project is to try and get us to focus on what's the actual problem in the United States that we should keep our eyes on and what do we need to address. And the real concern is not the declining US power or rising debt, but it's the authoritarian calls coming from inside the house, right? And of course, that is a transatlantic problem, right? I don't have to tell you that the EU is wrestling with the same things with Viktor Orban, maybe different degree of level of concern, but on both sides of the Atlantic, the countries that issue, the entities that issue the #1 and #2 international reserve currencies aren't in danger of losing their financial superpower status. What they're in danger of losing is their democracies at home, right? And so that is much more the big concern, right? All right, so I know I'm over time, so I'm gonna wrap up quickly here. Money is power. The US still has more of it than anyone else. And I've talked about both the geopolitical implications of that as well as the macroeconomic implications of that. We don't face the economic trade-offs that most people think we face. And when we think about the geopolitical or national security rival with China, whether we have that confrontation and we engage in a new Cold War is a totally different question. We could if we needed to, right? And we would be financially equipped to meet that challenge. Are there alternatives to the dollar? Probably not in our lifetimes. And again, do you expect any of these things to happen? Right? So it is possible the Eurozone could challenge the dollar. It is possible that the renminbi could challenge the dollar. It's possible that sometime in the late 21st or early 22nd century, we're talking about the rising Indian hegemon and the rupee as the dominant international currency. But that is very, very far on the horizon, I think, as a possibility. Right? And this is where I'll end again, right? There's a question of ability and there's a question of willingness, right? And the problems when we think about declining American hegemony or declining American influence or the risk to America's status in the world, those are almost entirely about getting our domestic house in order, right? Addressing the authoritarian problem, dysfunctional institutions, right? The problems of presidentialism in the Senate and the Electoral College and all these things that make it almost impossible to do anything productive in American policymaking. Those are the real problems, right? And we spend so much time thinking about the decline of hegemony, the rise of China, these sort of structural transformations, which again, we've been talking about for 50 years now, right? And they're always just over the horizon. Right? So I think if we can keep our eyes on the ball and think about what are the difficult solutions to those harder domestic problems, I don't know that I have good answers, but I think focusing on them is something that's really important. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, we can take a seat. You have deserved a little bit of a rest, right? So thanks a lot for this very insightful presentation, many interesting ideas. And we are very glad to have you here. And we are also very glad to have the opportunity to now discuss openly with everyone the issues that you mentioned. And the way I suggest to do this is I warm you up with one question from my side, and then we open the discussion for everyone. So it was great for me to sit here and take the students' perspective again, because usually I'm standing here and teaching our students about statistics and so on. And when I was looking at the charts that you showed, especially the charts for China, I noticed that the levels are very low. Mm-hmm. But there's also some interesting trends, right? And one thing that I learned, or that in my teaching experience is that we often underestimate exponential growth patterns.
Yes.
Right? And it's similar with trade, right? China was at low levels for a long time, but there were already some rises. And then there was some moment that kicked it off, like the WTO accession of China.
Yeah.
Is there something that could happen that kicks off some similar exponential growth?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the deltas and the levels are both important to look at. A decade ago, I thought there could be, in the sense that the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong, which was a major financial center, lots of people thought this was sort of the entry for eventually the renminbi, right, and Chinese private financial markets to replace Singapore, become like the third global financial center after London and New York. So that could obviously happen, but I think the thing we've seen with China now over the last 7 or 8 years under Xi Jinping is a increasing centralization of power and turning away from the kind of ongoing integration into globalization. What set that off was China joining the WTO, opening up to trade, manipulating its exchange rate less, pushing international economic integration, getting the state out of a larger share of the economy. And now Xi has reversed almost all of those trends. And I don't think anybody looks at Hong Kong these days and thinks about, right, this is the place where, so again, like China could do it. It's just, when you look at the domestic politics in China, I'm not a China expert, but what I've read, the people who are experts that I've talked to are very pessimistic over the next 10, 20 years about more Chinese openness and integration and liberalization. They're worried actually about the pendulum moving in the other direction.
Yeah, interesting. And that's where you see also our dangers, right? That if authoritarian...
yes, but it's a relative game, right? So, you could have democratic backsliding on both sides of the Atlantic, and the democratic backsliding in China is even worse, right? So, reserve currency status, hegemony, these things are relative. Where would you be more confident holding safe assets? It's still going to be Europe and the United States. And I think if Trump were to win again and that set off some broader democratic backsliding in the United States, I don't think what you would see is a shifting of assets from the US to China. You would see a shifting of assets from the US to Japan, to Canada, to Switzerland, right? You'd see a fragmentation. You'd see the rise of like the Aussie dollar and the Canadian loonie as safe havens, and because people were still looking for places that are open and democratic and property rights are protected, and so there'd be more fragmentation of that everybody else, right? But I don't think you would see a big change in like the dollar and euro's relative position vis-a-vis the renminbi.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, let's open the discussion, Verman. I see first hands raised, yeah.
I think I have to press the button. Good evening, and thank you very much for that exciting lecture.
Thank you.
As you obviously know, the dollar is a piece of paper which says IOU.
Yes.
So there's a psychological factor behind all currencies that you have to trust it. And you know that inflation, I remember what the British sterling used to be in exchange value, what it is today. That means that currencies are continually losing, over that period you showed, their face value in exchange context because of inflation and other developments, right? The only safe assets in this world, if I may state, are not pieces of paper which said IOU, because if they collapse, I can light a cigarette with them, but that's it. They're nothing that I can use again. The only safe assets in this world, by my understanding, considering a democracy, is property, a building, gold, which is limited till now, diamonds, which are also limited, and if you're very clever, you follow the art market, art.
Yes.
Because in every crisis of the past, when currencies have collapsed, only those 4 things regain a value in the new currency that develops or stable conditions, because they are not an IOU, they are physical property. Okay, you can't take a building with you, so if a democracy collapses and they nationalize everything, you've lost that one.
Yeah.
So, your whole thing's based on a psychological trust of human society in a piece of paper that promises you something that you can purchase?
Absolutely. I mean, money is a social construct, and we live in a world of fiat currencies. And there are not enough in today's global financial system of the assets of which you speak for everybody to hold them, right? So people are going to have to hold fiat currencies in the modern global economy. And the question is, which one or ones are you going to hold? And then it becomes a relative beauty contest, right? So again, if you think about, you look at the economic recovery of the US from COVID versus Europe or Japan or China, and you think about what do the next 10 or 15 years look like, and you're a lot more optimistic about actually the trajectory of the US economy, I think, than we were 2 or 3 years ago. But if you're going to pull your money out of the UK post-Brexit, or you're going to pull your money out of the US post-Trump, you have to put it somewhere else, right? And it won't be more safe in the authoritarian country that has strict outward capital controls than it will be, right, in the United States that has partially backslid democratically. So again, as I was saying to Jan, I think what you would see in that case is you would see a push into real estate, you would see a push into gold, but you would primarily see a move into the smaller reserve currencies, right, of the other Western countries. So you would see, a sharp appreciation of the Swiss franc because everybody wants to hold francs, a sharp appreciation of the Canadian loonie and the Aussie dollar and the Japanese yen. So you'd see some fragmentation, but none of those countries have large enough financial markets for everybody to do that. There are just not enough bonds and stocks, right, and currency in any of those countries to substitute for the dollar, right? It would have to be the euro. It would have to be China really deciding that it wanted to do that, which would then lead to massive currency appreciation, right? So if you had a 25% currency appreciation of the renminbi and the euro because of a flight from the dollar, that would destroy manufactured exports in both the Eurozone and in China, right? And that's the last thing that either of those economies wants. And so, it's in some ways, it's the saving grace for the United States is, right, the least worst investment over the last 60 years has been the United States, but that's how it works with reserve currencies. It's not what is the best optimal investment, it's what is it relative to the possible alternatives, right? So you would see, you're right, there will be people putting their money into gold and real estate, but that's a sort of, the 1% is gonna be doing that, and there's a lot of other transactions that are still gonna happen in fiat currencies.
Thank
you. In terms of US sovereign debt, is there any limit? Are there any guardrails? You've left open the possibility we could borrow endlessly. So,
I mean,
interesting thought, but you must have some limiting principles there.
So there's a limit out there, right? I mean, I don't think you have to make like an MMT style argument of this is unlimited and the government can do whatever it wants, but I don't think we're remotely near whatever that threshold is. And again, I come back to the example of Japan, right? So if you believe the worst case Congressional Budget Office projections over the next 30 years, we still will have a debt to GDP ratio far below what Japan is today, right? And so if we were able to sustain 40% debt to GDP, 20 years ago, and we're able to sustain 100 now, and there's no market pressure on bond and interest rates because of, there's the debt ceiling nonsense, but that's an artificial constraint, right? So it's out there. I don't know what the number is. It's just we're so far away from whatever that unsustainable level of debt is that there's about 37 other more immediate problems that we need to worry about. So the other thing is what has happened in the US in the last 3 years. The debt to GDP ratio has fallen by about 15% because growth is the one thing we know that actually, this is something that I've talked about with my colleagues about the Eurozone for a decade now, is the way to get debt to GDP in the Eurozone down is to have more growth, right? Which in the short term actually means probably accumulating more debt. And then you kind of will lower it in the long run. So that politically doesn't sell, but economically, more growth in the US is probably going to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio as the amount of global finance keeps growing and growing. So that, that constraint just seems very, very far away. And that's the part where most of the macroeconomists in the US who are talking about this just are not thinking about the open economy side of the macroeconomics, the exchange rates, the capital flows, the dollar's role, They're just sort of thinking about the US as a closed economy and there must be a hard budget constraint.
So just the policy implications of that are huge.
Yes.
Utterly huge.
Yeah. And I think not being able to think that way has kept us from thinking about what we could and should spend on climate, on infrastructure, on public education, on, you know, all of these things, because we have in our mind, you know, the bond vigilantes argument from the 1990s has never really gone away, right? And, you know, Bill Clinton talked about it, Barack Obama talked about it this way, the Republicans talk about it, of balancing the budget, running a budget surplus is something that is not just good economics, but it's also sort of morally virtuous, right? And again, that debate is a transatlantic phenomenon, the politics around that. Yeah.
There were some remarks on this side.
Yeah.
Let's start here.
Yeah.
Oops, I'm sorry. I have a question to you. Do you know what has been in the last 10, 15 years, exactly since 2010 has been one of the most stable currency in the world? You wouldn't believe it. It's a Thai baht. At that 2010, I changed almost a big part of my money, what I saved, into Thai baht. It's still there. So I gained 25%, and just in the currency gained. And it has been stable with very little march to the ratio was 50 baht to 1 euro. I compare you, the dollar is similar. And now it's been since the last 10 years, 38 to 1 euro. Do you know how it comes that it is so stable? That tiny currency of that tiny country. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know the specifics of the Thai case. I mean, it is possible, you know, smaller open economies that are investing in manufactured exports and are sort of growing very fast, there's going to be increasing demand for their currency. And, you know, again, you could think about a small number of investors could move into Thai baht or move into, you know, Korea and Indonesia and other sort of fast-growing emerging market countries. But you couldn't move all of the assets that are in the US and in the Eurozone, right? There just are not enough of them to play that reserve currency role. So as an individual investor, it might make sense in the same way that moving your money into gold or real estate might make sense. As a global reserve currency, Thailand wouldn't want that because it would mean a substantial appreciation of the baht, which again would undermine the kind of export-led growth that they've been pursuing.
Thank you again for your presentation. Yeah. This was about hegemony, this lecture. And coming back into it, the dollar is, in the end, a means of exchange. So to what degree do you think that all this financial power really trumps a potential chokehold on key resources that China would have, for example, in cobalt mines in Congo or Taiwan, for example?
So is the question like, could the US weaponize the dollar to gain control of those, or
how much you use this as a way to justify that the US isn't close to lose this hegemony? To what degree would that really be useful in case of a crisis?
Right. So, I mean, hegemony is multidimensional, right? And again, the point was not to argue that China has not risen and become much more powerful along a bunch of different dimensions, right? We don't live in the world of the 1990s where it was really the unipolar moment and there was everybody else. So China is big and important in many ways, but I do think the ultimate root of most power in international relations is about money and finance, right? Or at least the durability of hegemony is primarily about that. And again, it's if you're going to think about China's ability to build up its military and spend as much as the US does, both in absolute terms and as a share of GDP, to scale up rare earth minimal manufacturing, the AI industry, whatever you want to sort of think about as the dimensions of China increasing its power, that requires money. And it's going to require a set of financial policies, which are the exact opposite of what it's doing, right? If China became a bigger player in global finance, demand for renminbi would go through the roof, That means the renminbi is going to appreciate. There's going to be pressure to remove capital controls, right? It's going to be hard to have the export-led growth model with heavy state ownership that has been the engine of Chinese development for the last 30 years now. They're going to need another model, and it's going to be primarily based on shifting towards domestic consumption and running trade and current account deficits. And China could do that, but that's going to require a whole host of domestic political shifts. Right. It doesn't seem that Xi Jinping wants to go that route.
I mean, I see your point, but at the same time, that money is used to buy something. And if you can't buy it, then what good does that make if all the mines are closed, let's say?
Well, so this is why China still holds a massive amount of US treasuries, right? What does China do with its export surpluses? It recycles them back to buy US treasuries because that prevents the appreciation of the renminbi and the depreciation of the dollar. And so, you know, we used to call those the global imbalances. I guess we kind of still do, but that structural codependency still exists, right? And I don't think either side has a good answer, the US or China, for how to break that. I mean, there was a lot of talk in the last 3-5 years now with Trump and under Biden of decoupling. There's been very, very little actual decoupling. There's been a reshuffling of value chains, but because neither side really can live without the other.
There are some remarks on this side, a lady.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. My question is about the ways that financialization and authoritarianism kind of co-constitute each other in the US, I would argue. Really interesting to think about, like, the kind of takeaway of your presentation being the threat is authoritarianism. And at least what I would think is that the financialization that we've seen that has allowed US hegemony in this financial sense over time has given rise to the populism that has kind of given rise to the potential for authoritarianism.
Yep.
And so I guess the reason it's not a threat is because, yeah, it's all kind of relative, as we talked about. But I guess I wonder, yeah, what do you make of that, really?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have a good answer. I think I would distinguish between the globalization of finance and the role of the dollar in the international financial system and the financialization of the US economy, meaning like moving towards more securitization of things and the shift from like traditional banking to bond financing and stock markets and securities and things like that. I think the concentration of wealth and the concerns about how that feeds populism is primarily about that second thing, right? In that, going back to the financial crisis and mortgage-backed securities and, you know, capital gains tax rates being different from standard income tax rates in the US, right? That's about that second type of financialization and securitization of the US economy that I think has fueled, on some dimensions, a lot of the populism in the United States. But the dominance of the dollar predates all of that, right? You can go back to the American financial system of the 1950s and 60s, and it was much more kind of old school commercial banking system in which the dollar was dominant. And even after Bretton Woods in the 1970s and 80s, that's really a kind of post-1990s phenomenon that we've seen that. So I do think that has played a role, not just in the US, but across the rich industrialized democratic world of fueling populism in the wake of the financial crises since 2008. But it's sort of a separate dimension from, I don't think the dominance of the dollar hurts because if anything in particular in this last crisis, it has enabled us to spend an enormous amount of money to help the economy recover very quickly in ways that we didn't from 2008 to 18. And, you know, other countries felt like they couldn't do that, I think, because they lacked the financial resources that the US did. That's a good question. I need to think more about that, but yeah.
Well, we got lots of additional questions and remarks. We have to keep an eye on the time, but let's have 3 more questions. I think you were first.
You mentioned, thank you for the most exciting lecture. You mentioned fiat current money, but you didn't mention artificial currencies such as Bitcoin. Is that because it's essentially Geld ohne Land and therefore of no relevance? And the other question is, you made such a convincing pitch of the United States as the preeminent power trumping just about everything. So it seems the United States is very happy in its unrivaled and unassailable #1 position. So why are people in Washington then so obsessed with, underperforming countries such as Germany spending an incremental pfennig on its defense budget if it's anyway a penny halfpenny contribution and doesn't change the dial?
Yeah. Let me start with this, I guess the second one. So, some of that is uniquely one presidential candidate, I think. But it is an implication, right? I mean, one implication of this is the US in terms of what it can afford to spend on defense spending and on NATO, right? We really don't have a constraint. We have a political constraint, not a material economic constraint. And it doesn't really matter 2%, right? The flip side of that is, and it goes back to the earlier question of kind of opening up other possibilities in the United States. We have all these other things because we spend an inordinate amount of our budget on the military that politically it's hard to build support for spending on infrastructure and public education and climate and all these other things when you are spending so much on the military. And again, I think I'm a political scientist, right? The politics of it is not only would it be good, I think, if Europeans were spending more on defense, right? But it would help the political debate in the United States if you could go to Congress and make our allies are carrying more of the burden. Now can we spend more on, things at home? The first one, yeah, so I didn't talk about cryptocurrencies because I don't believe they're currencies, right? So if you think about, right, money is a social construct, but money performs 3 functions, right? It's a unit of account, it's a medium of exchange, and it's a store of value, and Bitcoin doesn't meet any of those, right? And it is a barbarous relic in the sense of you can't increase the supply of it countercyclically, just like you couldn't. We tried that global monetary experiment twice in the 19th century and then in the interwar period, right? With having a fixed asset gold that you couldn't increase the supply in downturns, and it was disastrous, right? And we sort of finally learned the lesson that flexible exchange rates and currencies that, that are not just backed by metal, right, are probably the way to go. So, as a safe asset in the global economy as opposed to a speculative asset, I don't see a role anytime soon. There's some discussion of digital reserve currencies, that the Fed and the ECB would issue, and that may play out. So far, it seems a bit like an application in search of a problem, right? But maybe 10 years from now, we've figured out what the utility of those actually is. But even those are different because they're backed by governments. They're not just kind of out there in the ether.
So we have to do unjust to many questions, but you have raised your hand for a long time. So maybe.
I know Michael Pettis, who you referenced in the slideshow, to me at least seems agnostic about the benefits of the US being a global financial hegemon. He kind of talks about the spending space you get from it, but also the trade-offs of increased inequality and suppressed manufacturing. I guess not to return to the financialization question too much, but he at least makes the point that decreasing capital controls and increased financialization makes it harder to tax billionaires in capital and kind of democratically wrangle it.
Yeah.
And he thinks that, I think he's made the argument that it's actually a bad deal for the US to be as dominant as it is. Would you agree, and do you buy his connection between global hegemony in the space and inequality?
So, yeah, I mean, the argument, I know the argument and it's a reasonable one. I guess my view of it is the likelihood of, I sort of think about that in terms of those horses left the barn 40 years ago. And I don't know that we're going back to a world of the judicious use of capital controls or a world of, 4 or 5 competing currencies, because historically that was never stable. Barry Eichengreen at Berkeley has also made this argument that the historical norm could be you have 2 or 3 currencies and not one that is so preeminently dominant. And I guess I think where I agree with Pettis is there is a world in which the dollar is 45% instead of 60%, and the euro is 30% instead of 20%, and maybe the renminbi is 10 or 15%. And that could be stable, and it might be better for those reasons that Pettis brings up. Again, just with my political science hat on, the things that would have to happen in China and the EU to get to that point seem so remote for me. And so I guess I sort of start from the standpoint of, right, we're sort of stuck with the fact that the dollar is so overwhelmingly dominant. We may as well think about how we can productively use that financial power to address some of the problems that go with it at home. And again, I come back to what we were talking about earlier, that you do have perhaps greater inequality in these structural imbalances, but that's not what's stopping the US from spending more on the social welfare state or spending more on public education or infrastructure. There's domestic political things that are doing that. And really kind of focusing on overcoming those, I think, is the way to go. I see this as much more, whether you like it or not, it is a characteristic of the international system that's going to be around now for many decades.
Okay, time for one last question. Make it a good one.
I'm still trying to understand how financial hegemony translates to power hegemony. As the reason stated, exorbitant privilege means that you don't have the manufacturing capacity, you have deindustrialization. So how would you compete as a power when you have 5 shipyards compared to, say, 500 Chinese shipyards? You know, because the logic of sovereign debt also means that countries like Russia and China can pursue military Keynesianism, no matter how America is coercing these countries.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, how are they going to afford it? They're going to have to raise taxes or issue more debt. And that's going to have financial implications for the exchange rate. It's going to have implications for whether or not they need to be open to international finance or not. You know, I don't think that it is productive to think about the US and China getting into an arms race about who has the most, you know, the most military production capacity. But if China is going to do that, and it's going to devote that amount of resources, or Russia is going to do that, you're talking about shifting an enormous share of your GDP into certain sectors of the economy at the expense of other things, right? So there are, you know, just like the US faces all kinds of trade-offs about guns versus butter, kind of domestic spending versus military spending. China could absolutely do that. Russia is doing that right now, right? But it's cannibalizing all of the rest of its economy, right? And, you know, China's got enormously more economic capacity than Russia does, both on the physical capital and the human capital side. But I think to do that over the long term actually requires a reorientation towards international finance and kind of to opening up to the global economy, which would push it towards maybe having incentives to not want to do that in the first place, right? So I think there are trade-offs involved there.
So it's like a financial short-term gamble, effectively.
I don't know if it's a gamble. I mean, I just think it's, you know, prioritizing a set of policies now that have certain costs and benefits, where as you get bigger and more powerful, the benefit side starts to diminish and the cost sides become clearer and clearer and more expensive. You know, and I can see maybe China wants to do that now over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, but after 20 years, I'm not sure it would still want to, right? You know, the US is having this debate about bringing manufacturing home, and are we going to invest more and produce more? You know, I think broadly that debate in the US, you look at like the decline of manufacturing as a share of employment in the US, and it goes back to the 1860s, and it's like a straight line down, right? So you can bring back manufacturing as a share of GDP, but you're not going to bring back manufacturing in the US as a share of employment because of automation and mechanization. And so I think there's a limit for the US and for China about how much you can kind of structurally transform the economy by focusing on military and heavy manufacturing and things of those sorts. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mark, for sharing your insights and the results from your research. That was fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sorry for everyone who wasn't able now to place their questions, but there's good news. Mark is in Berlin for some more time, so maybe there's some opportunity where you can grab him and
yes,
let's
you can reach me here, and
let's thank him again for this wonderful.
Thank you very much.